I want to introduce two people that I think are really interesting and potentially good sources for you. And we're going to ask them to, do their thing, but just to give you sort of a sense of why we've asked them here. So Seth Carmody is Vice President of Regulatory Strategy at MedCrypt, and I realize that that really doesn't mean a whole lot. Yeah, you're going to explain what it means. But basically, I think the threshold question is, why should we trust these people? So let's just take that on. So Seth was at FDA, and he wrote the cybersecurity strategy. So he has spent a lot of time thinking about what it means, how it would be real, how it would be manifested. I'm going to let him talk about that. So Seth has a lot of very distinguished credentials, which you have in your bio packet, but let me just mention a few things. Some of the papers that he's written about that I find interesting. Rubric for applying CVSS to medical devices, playbook for threat modeling medical devices, building resilient medical technology supply chain. I hope you're getting the thread of sort of what Seth has been thinking about lately. So Seth, you've won industry awards for various innovation, security, leadership awards. Just to be fair, you're in front of a crowd that doesn't believe that information security exists. Am I fair? Is this fair, guys? And that we think that everything that can be hacked will be hacked. Am I right? I'll let you guys elaborate. So basically, why should, my threshold question, which I hope you guys, and I know you guys will answer in your presentation, is, why should we believe that the government is actually going to do anything to prevent this stuff? Because we know that everything has already been hacked and already blah, 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 blah. And I know that it's your job to try to do better. So with that, let me turn to Kyle. And I know it's a really easy introduction, right? Okay. So Kyle is a leader in medical device security. So he's the guy, basically, that is in charge of making sure that the vice president's pacemaker, doesn't get turned up and kill the vice president. Like, really easy job, right? Am I right? Okay. Among Kyle's very interesting experiences is that he has tried to, I'm not sure what really this means, but implement novel techniques on constrained systems such as cardiac implementation devices. Okay, so this is the guy that is trying to make sure that the vice president can't be assassinated by turning the dial. So I will leave the rest to you. You guys, thank you so much. First of all, for being with us. Second, for putting up with our very rude and intrusive questions. And over to you.
Thank you. Awesome. I really like that intro. It's fantastic. I have been thinking about this problem for a long time, and I'm actually interested in hearing what your experiences and like pressure testing the things that I've sort of concluded. And to your point, everything is hackable. It's really a matter of how many resources you want to expend to do it, right? You can't build perfect systems. And getting it right, getting it enough is really a question that we have to answer as a society. I'll warn you, this is all my graphic artistry. I'm responsible for all of this, I'm sorry. So I wrote a white paper, Why Healthcare Cybersecurity is Hard. I think it will set Kyle up and sort of establish the ground floor of the things that we struggle with in healthcare. What I don't mention is that we absorb actually what makes information security hard. So not only do we have what makes information security hard, but we have what makes healthcare unique and also more harder. I'm not sure that's a word. So there was no greater emphasis on what healthcare is supposed to do. What is our core competency? What are these businesses designed to do? And that is brought to bear in a pandemic, right? When you have healthcare focusing healthcare. So when I talk about why healthcare cybersecurity is hard, it's because we have built an entire supply chain around delivering healthcare. It is our core competency. It's what we must do. And if we deviate from that, there are real tangible and excruciating consequences. What we've also asked people to do, like the Medtronics and the Mayos of the world, is to also do that and also be secure. And it's almost an orthogonal skill set. It's really challenging. we have to address that as a society. I'm not really exactly sure how we do that. And in fact, what happens is we actually put it on the consumer. So I'm talking about medical devices here. I'm talking about technology, medical technology in general, but it's actually a trend in the consumer space. Like when I build something, if I don't know how to do it, if I don't know how to do it securely, then I pass that debt to the consumer, right? And then they're sort of left to deal with the consequences. And we see this in the data, right? Like we see ransomware events. Well, do you ever see a ransomware event that impacts anything other than a hospital? I'm talking about healthcare. Like when do you hear about non-consumers that are getting impacted by ransomware? And the fact of the matter is that the technology debt accumulates in the consumer, right? It accumulates for us, whether we're wearing our smartwatches or we're running a hospital system. And the thing is like healthcare does healthcare. We have to allow them to deliver healthcare. So when that impacts the healthcare delivery institutions, our physicians and our patients, it compromises their ability to deliver what their core competency is. Do you really want to, and by the way, the indications for some of the infusion pumps that I worked on was at the FDA are indicated for 2-year-olds, right? Do you really want, as a 2-year-old, really equipped to defend their insulin pump against state-sponsored hackers? Absolutely not, right? And you wouldn't ever expect that. So we really need to think about this as how we pass and minimize the security and technical debt being passed to our consumers. We only have to look at the data. These are from 2001 or 2021. But the news, probably some of you folks have written about it, like it happens nearly every week. There's some cybersecurity issue for healthcare. And that's because they're focused on delivering healthcare. It's hard to do security as well. So how do we start to shift left? So I've written papers where we're trying supply chain shift left. We actually need to shift that responsibility to the producers of the technology, like the Medtronics of the world. One of the principal driving forces, because Mayo is focused on delivering healthcare, world-class international healthcare, or class healthcare care, is to have the regulator. So I had a front row seat for this. We can look at this as sort of the EPA, right? The EPA is the market driver for, in this case, when PCBs get dumped into the Hudson River and accumulate, right? Because consumers are buying TVs not because the ability of the manufacturer to minimize economic or environmental pollutants to the Hudson River. You have to have somebody, some watchdog, somebody who's alleviating that information asymmetry to the consumer, like the EPA. And infrastructure is really an interesting topic. It's super boring. Like who wants to spend money on infrastructure? So critical infrastructure, healthcare, agriculture, electrical, like power, right? Water. These spending money as consumers is really, it's hard, right? We want to spend money on, I don't know, Buffalo Bills new stadium out of New York. I think it was like to the tune of $5 billion. That's where our money goes. But filling potholes is really painful. By the way, the internet is undefeated. Look at here, a pothole filling truck stuck on a pothole. I mean, you can't. I'll let you folks fill it in. All right, so the FDA is playing that role like the EPA, right? That they serve the purpose of as a sort of barrier to market for reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy, right? You want devices to be safe and efficacy because when a physician goes to use that device, you don't want them to be like, oh, what does consumer reports say for the pacemaker, right? They just need to be able to use it, and a patient can't make decisions when they're unconscious, right? So you need some neutral arbiter to be like, hey, look, this device is safe and effective. And it's secure. So you need FDA to do that. The problem is you hired people like this guy. And if you can tell by the environs there that as a chemical fume hood, I am actually a PhD organic chemist. And I went to the FDA and somehow ended up writing technical policy because that's what protectors do. They jump into roles that maybe they're not entirely qualified for, but they will do it because they know it is right and they serve the people that they're trying to protect. And actually, healthcare does healthcare, right? We're trying to solve for pandemics. We're trying to solve for the latest clinical problems, right? So asking the FDA, who's consisting of physicians and biomedical engineers, to also do security is part of the problem, just like we asked hospitals, physicians, and patients to do, right? We're asking this guy to also solve for cybersecurity. Risky proposition, I know. I think there was a talk about healthcare is divided, right? FDA regulates medical devices. Well, medical devices are defined in regulation. Right? And there's some technologies that don't meet that regulation. So they're just, who regulates them? Well, EHR is Office of the National Coordinator regulates EHRs. What about protected health information? That's Office of Civil Rights, OCR, right? Well, what about the stuff that doesn't make that definition? FTC? So there's this patchwork of regulation and regulatory bodies that cover different technologies. It's really fractured. And you know what? Adversaries don't care. They really don't care. They love it, right? Because there are gaps in the coverage that are in the economic driver that will enforce cybersecurity into these devices. Driving this down to the Center for Devices, this is Jeff Shuren, the center director. I'm not making fun of Jeff, he's a great guy. But he said, hey, look, our regulatory model is messed up. It's based on pills, right? Computers are not pills. FDA, Center for Devices, derived their entire regulatory structure from Center for Drugs, right? So the manufacture of a static, deterministic pill and the regulations that surround that and support that do not support computing systems at all. Computer systems are non-deterministic. They are dynamic, right? So we need an entirely different model. And if we get this model, and if we have regulators like the FDA that are seeking new authorities, which they are, and we can talk about that specifically, like where that is today, asking for additional resources, they can say, hey, look, this isn't good enough to pass to market, and we can start to shift that security investment to the Medtronics of the world and say, hey, look, you really have to invest in security, Medtronic, to actually meet the market, because the market's not capable of making this determination.
Wanted to talk a little bit about how Hollywood has portrayed cybersecurity, specifically in medical devices, because I think it's quite an interesting topic for many reasons. And by no means am I trying to say that we don't believe in threats. If anything, I learned from my partner over here that threats are real. The FDA thinks that threats are real. Medtronic thinks that threats are real. The MedSows and the ISACs of the world work together to look for indicators of threats across medical devices, infrastructure, technology. Threats are real, and we take them seriously. And threat modeling, which Seth has some accolades in, is one of the tools that we use to model risk and model these adversaries. However, in some ways, Hollywood has portrayed this as a bit, their game is production value, right? But they portrayed it in a way that my fear is it could scare patients into not going after devices that could provide life-saving therapy. So I wanted to give us about a 5-minute video. It's a montage that I put together, my team put together, on just some fun scenarios, and then we'll kind of talk through a little bit about what's real and what's not. Being an incident responder, like I've been in scenarios where like active attacks have happened or doing forensics on an attack. The idea of, DoD grade 9 encryption and all of that fun stuff is obviously just jargon. Four hands on the keyboard, obviously hilarious. The ironic thing, in some scenarios, you do want to isolate memory by pulling a machine off the network, or in their case, unplugging it. It's probably the closest thing to like any kind of reality, isolating a machine that might be patient zero and infecting your network. But overall, that's obviously just for effect and comic relief a little bit there. So I would say the second scenario, which is New Amsterdam, is my most concerning scenario actually of all of them. Newer show, ransomware attack, very real, like something that has happened, as we mentioned, to hospitals. But the concept of it crossing over to every single medical device in the hospital and being able to be remotely controlled like a pacemaker, that is absolutely something that can happen with a device, but not in the scenario of a ransomware attack. So a medical device like what I have here, actually that's the wrong one. This is a Bluetooth-enabled pacemaker. So this device has two components. It has a microcontroller that controls the therapy. That is actually, and I'll talk a little bit about a schematic on this, that is also separated with a physical draw on the board to a different device that does the Bluetooth telemetry. So it is one hop to the internet. So either my mobile phone can connect to it asynchronously, right? Or one of these wands can magnetically connect with it and then interface with a mobile phone in this case, or in other cases, a bedside monitor, which will look for a communication from the device. But it is not a synchronous connection that could be in the network, as she said, right? So if they're in the network, they would have to have compromised an endpoint device that was in proximity, probably 9 meters. There's attenuation in the body, but to the person. So really, if you want to stop the shocks, the magnet mode would work. That is a magnetic switch that tells the CPU to stop and turns it into a safe pacing mode. Or literally, let's just say in the worst case scenario, they did hack all the instruments in the environment. You take him away from the device. You can't communicate over Bluetooth at a certain distance. So there's really no scenario where somebody would come in from the outside, have been hacked onto the device. There's no GPS in this device. There's no, wireless chip to the sense of like connecting to a Wi-Fi or under network. This isn't routable. But it does have wireless telemetry that does communicate to the internet. So there is one hop that could very real cause a scenario that would be a security concern. That's why we take it seriously. But in the ransomware attack, kind of all-encompassing scenario of a hospital, this is probably never in the blast radius that you'd have to worry about it. And there's ways that you could get the patient out. I talk about the GPS as well because of The Gray Man, so the Ryan Gosling movie. The irony with that is I actually got an email from the production crew of The Gray Man asking me if that was possible. And with my partners in communications, we responded and said, no, but we'd be happy to talk about scenarios that maybe would make sense, a GPS in somebody's pocket that everybody carries around with them. But no, they wanted to go with the idea of the pacemaker being connected, which I get it. It plays to the story narrative, but this is not a way to track you in the sense that they portray it. I have run experiments on Bluetooth connectivity. So the theory of maybe I drop backpacks with Bluetooth beacons around here, and this advertises, right? Everything advertises looking for a connection. For power constraints, because this has to survive 10 to 12 years in 100% humidity in the body on one charge, we only communicate every 3 minutes. We can put it into a fast advertising mode, but only for a certain period of time. We don't want to drain the battery. The Bluetooth chip can be expensive on the battery. So we put beacons in. We tried to see if you could triangulate somebody in a room. In theory, you can, but you have a 3-minute lag. So you would have to have these beacons around the world, like looking for that person and to be able to track them. It is something we're thinking about as battery technology gets better and as we consider like what the privacy concerns could be for somebody having a Bluetooth device in their body. Just right now, the constraints of the system, the constraints of the technology, the use cases, it's not a threat in the sense of what we've seen. So that's why I say the Gray Man has an idea for our future threat models as we get improvements in technology that we have to consider. And if you think about it, this was a mechanical device that we sold, right? We started to back in the wireless technology, which brings me to my final video of the vice president being hacked, which is based on a scenario of a vice president having a Medtronic device, but not being hacked, obviously, to the point of being killed. However, there are scenarios where your threat model might change and you're a high-value target, so to speak, and you might take risk and appropriate risk measures accordingly. But in the case of looking up a serial number and then being able to wirelessly kill someone with a defibrillator or a pacemaker, any life-saving device, the same constraints apply. I'll just give you one constraint, bandwidth. This is a phone line. So if you think about it, you're dialing up to the internet to even connect. So this would have had to have been dialed in, connected in. The network would have had to have been compromised. That individual would not be getting real-time feedback from the device like they showed. Now, there's a perfectly plausible scenario if they're sitting in the next room and they've been trying to hack the wireless telemetry directly. But again, you have proximity, you can move out of the way, you can do other things. So trying to show kind of the fact versus fiction and that while we can dramatize that for production value, it makes total sense. The systems themselves do not fit into those exact threat models. Not something that we should ever take lightly. And again, we're always taking that into account when we look at the future and new technology. You want to go to the next slide, Seth? Sure.
I thought I would mention, Kyle, that the regulatory bar for marketing is not 100% safety and efficacy. It's a reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy, right? And what you're talking about, I don't know if it freaks anybody out. He's like, well, there is some risk here. There's always some risk,
yeah,
right? That's what we're dealing with in healthcare space. Like there is a risk of a heart condition. There is a risk of diabetes, and the benefit risk is always important to weigh.
So this is just a little bit more of a crude schematic that we put together. Other things that we've designed into the device to think about a zero trust model to the outside world. So the Bluetooth chip in here, as I said, has a constrained serial connection to the CPU. This does all your pacing. This looks for shock. This will deliver joules if you need a defibrillation. The battery has 2 separate draws on the board, so physically separated from the Bluetooth chip. If we detect anything weird, like the Bluetooth chip turned on too long, somebody trying to remotely exploit a vulnerability on the Bluetooth chip, we will sever the connection to the battery and turn the chip off. That doesn't mean you can't connect to the device. We do have an inductive wire, or an inductive like NFC, like taptivation on your phone, or communication proprietary with a proximity to the device that will wake it up. It doesn't shut the device down. We had a vulnerability come out from some researchers in Singapore, in about 2019, sorry. And they basically were like looking at all IoT. They called it the Swan-tooth vulnerability. Specifically in the Swan-tooth vulnerability, they listed a number of products that were having issues with the Bluetooth chipset that was on the device. And you can easily go to the Bluetooth SIG and look up all the devices that have that chipset. And guess what? This pacemaker in my hand has that chipset. So it was technically vulnerable. We were able to demonstrate through their exploit code this working. So we attacked the chip, basically knocked the chip out, took control over it. And we were able to show I have a video of this, but I didn't provide it. And if anyone would like to see it, I can provide that afterwards, that we can turn off that Bluetooth chip and safely deliver therapy to the patient. And additionally, we did it with a defibrillator, induced a tachycardia, and showed that while it was still under attack, it would deliver the shock that it needed to save the patient. So the idea of that, we're getting better with the ideas of threat modeling on the chipset and on the device to make sure that we're considering when you use off-the-shelf Bluetooth or any kind of chip off the shelf, there are going to be real risks. It doesn't absolve us from ever having to patch them or fix them, but it gives us layers of mitigation. So even for these one-off scenarios where somebody is close to the device and leveraging an attack, we've built in control. So, and this has not always been the case, right? Like we've learned over time to improve to like look at these models, but Bluetooth introducing a new risk and a new threat, right, to the products that we have had us, reconsider our architecture. I'm going to go to the next slide.
I think you touched on an important point, Kyle, and that is that it wasn't always this way.
No.
Right? That this is progress. The fact that Kyle is standing here and talking to you about what they're considering from a threat perspective is absolute progress. We got a ways to go.
We do.
It's an industry, for sure.
So I wanted to just talk about remote monitors. And again, this is through the lens of cardiac rhythm management, but a lot of these monitors and this technology is used in our neuro division. We also have instruments similar that are leveraged through our pumps and our diabetes group. So think of anything wearable or insertable. These devices have some sort of IoT-based system that sits next to your bedside and monitors for you. So I have the second generation here. This is actually technically the second generation. I have the third generation here. When we developed the second generation, this is the one that came after the Homeland monitor that you saw. We had some hardware security issues. We disclosed some vulnerabilities that you can actually see those on our Medtronic security disclosure site. A lot of it was just fundamentally how we designed the product that added flaws. There's an SD card in there. There's just so much you can do with it. And there's lots of publication across the internet on this product having security weaknesses. We patched some of them, we fixed some of them, we've mitigated some of them. So that was a big push for us, right? Like before, I think we would just normally accept that risk. But over, like looking at threat models, looking at risk, looking at where these reside, someone's bedroom, maybe with them on their plane while they're in transit, in their, on their bedside in their hospital here, or in their hotel here outside of a hospital. Those devices have a unique kind of asynchronous threat to them. They're not behind a firewall. They're not, they're on your person usually or in your bedroom. So we considered all of those threats and made deterministic risk with our partners at FDA and a little shove, right? Seth specifically to make changes around that and actually address some of those security weaknesses. We learned and we improved definitely the hardware architecture in this product. So it's a lot more difficult to even like do any sort of reconnaissance or any sort of reverse engineering on this product. We made some really strong hardware improvements. We also improved the network communication security. So just adding some really good aspects of authorization and some really good aspects of connectivity, network data in transit. So privacy really around the data that it's leaving. It's on here as well. We've just made some significant upgrades to this product. And now we're at the next generation that should be our bedside monitor for the next 10 to 15 years. So if you think about it, we're designing implants that are going to be in somebody's body for 10 to 12 years. They might be manufactured for 20. We're trying to future-proof around that, right? That's very difficult. We're doing the same thing for these bedside monitors. These last for years. And while we might make components modular, where we can drop them in and make improvements to the hardware itself or update software when we make those improvements, we're still dealing with something that's going to be around. And if you go to eBay, very accessible because it's hard to keep these, from circulating third-party markets. Even though all the labeling and all of that says not to, they show up on eBay for good, bad, or otherwise. But as we've learned, we've actually developed this concept of observability and security testing in-house. So that's our Security Fusion Center concept. You see that down here on the bottom. We're looking at anonymized data, but active attack scenarios on these types of devices. So think all of these are hitting the internet. That's a concern. I haven't seen, and I'm not trying to brag about Medtronic here, but I haven't seen anybody take this approach yet to really look for a breach. Because of my background, that was something I really wanted to bring to the med device industry, was like, attacks are real, scenarios are real, but if we don't have data on what's happening, how can we better design products? And so we have about 2.5 years worth of millions and millions of transmissions off devices that are specifically looking for authorization and authentication attacks, memory-based corruption. We're using some tooling and telemetry custom as well as from some third-party vendors to do that. And so we're aggregating that data anonymized. There's no patient information. There's no serial number of the implant even in here. We're just starting to get to the point where we actually know what type of implant is coming off the device, let alone so we've been really cautious about the type of data we collected, making sure that's used for the improvement of security in the device in the field. And that's what we're implementing in the next generation. So we've learned from all of that data. We've optimized, for that security observability. And we're also making sure that we can be better about software updates, which is a huge problem in this world. And if anyone's heard of the software bill of materials push from many of the regulators, that's a reason why we've looked specifically at security updatability on device. I think I got one more slide. Okay, this builds, so I apologize, but I just wanted to give you the landscape of our implants and remote monitoring. Again, when we got products, we talked a little bit about what it looks like, but the Bluetooth connection on these devices to your phone or to your bedside monitor has 2 layers of encryption. Think about it of, you don't really trust public Wi-Fi. We don't trust Bluetooth encryption at its core. So we added an application layer encryption. So just think about like using a VPN on Wi-Fi. We have added that layer of security on top of the communication to the phone. Oh, sorry, Seth, make you build a slide here. So we add that 2 layers of encryption to the device. So that's secure and confidential as it's transmitting to the device. Build it out one more time. We've architected both the mobile app and the bedside monitor to be just a simple pass-through. So we talk about regulation and we talk about the grade of security, or the rating of a device, medical or not. In some cases, these bedside monitors, not all, are considered non-medical. It's also because the data is not resident or stored on the device. It's a simple pass-through. There's basically an encryption layer on the data and then an encryption layer at the network layer. And we just literally stage it and ship it, right? I mean, technically in near real time, there's some resident memory, but if you were to do forensic autopsy on one of these devices, you wouldn't find any data. That's the good thing with it. As we move forward, we do have some level of machine learning that we're doing data analysis on clinical outcomes. So we're trying to do improvements in detection of heart failure scenarios so that a doctor's not combing through millions of records on John Doe. He is getting higher fidelity alerts that he might have had an event. So we have added a layer. This is a very simple locked algorithm though. And it's actually, the FDA has guidance now as well around AI and ML, specifically with concerns around how that data might be translated. In this case, it's really just trying to make better alerts, more high fidelity alerts to the doctor. And then finally, we kind of cross the internet there, and so that uses all the standard end-to-end encryption. And we use traditional security controls, firewalls, identity access management to protect the infrastructure. So the doctor goes in through their clinician portal. It's like a software as a service solution, and they look up the data on the patient, and they call them in if they need to be seen because maybe they've had an event. So I just really wanted to kind of come back to how we're treating this. And the concerns I still have today are all the threat models that we talked about, but also entropy of this encryption, right? Like over time, technology is going to get faster, stronger. You talk about quantum, right? Whatever. But in each platform and generation, we are now considering hardware acceleration. These devices are 8-bit processors. That's a Nintendo, an NES, a NES, whatever you call it. That's a Nintendo in your chest today. We're upgrading that, obviously, in our next foundational platforms. We will be doing more improved authentication, authorization, and encryption, even though we're using that layer here in the next generation to try to future-proof devices as much as possible into the next 2 decades. So those are the problems we face. That's the constrained system idea. But the push from the regulators, the push from, frankly, the public, even a little bit of the push from Hollywood has made us have this need for this responsibility. And we do believe it's a real thing. It's just the way it's portrayed. So.
You made an interesting point about the lifetime of the devices. That's one of the heavy constraints that healthcare has. When you think about mobile phones and the technology, when you build it, like how long do I have to sustain it? Like how long do I have to update a phone over the expected lifetime? It's much, much, much shorter than medical devices, like 10 to 12 years for a pacemaker. But I mean, you have some capital equipment sit in hospitals that like multiple decades, like literally 30 and 40 years that these things are clinically relevant. They're delivering their job time after time after time, but it's in the face of this dynamic environment. I mentioned the pill model being, not appropriate, right? Like that the software degrades over time, right? From a security perspective. So when he's thinking about how to design devices, he's like 20 years, like nobody has to design it for 20 years, not even the giants in the technology sector.
Well, to that last point, I'm wondering in general sort of why there's maybe a lack of innovation in this space right now. Or maybe there isn't. I'm not
Specifically to what? Like
in terms of to the improvement of sort of medical devices beyond the Nintendo, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think I can answer some of that, and Seth, you feel free to jump in. The manufacturing of the device continues for several years after you invest in the product, but you're making that like point in time choice. Let's just say, the older microcontroller that's an 8-bit NES. It will be in a patient for 10 to 12 years, but it'll also be manufactured for another 10. So you kind of have this like curve, right? That at some point will peak with the population. And quite frankly, we have a patient researcher who actually has a defibrillator on our team. She's kind of a patient advocate for us, and we've come to bring her into the discussion more because she has that cybersecurity thought process. But she's had 3 devices in her life. And what she'll tell you is it is painful to have a device removed. Nobody wants to explant. There's complications. That's why the New Amsterdam situation scares me a little. Like that's the scenario they went to instead of trying to reprogram the device or moving them away. It's that the device kind of walks the dog of the technology. If we put a device in that has Bluetooth, we got to make sure nowadays we can upgrade it. 20 years ago, we didn't really think of the security innovation problem. And it's come to a head because of that tech debt. And so innovation is now happening, I would say, in this front. You're also seeing vendors and others come into this space over the last 5 to 10 years, maybe
5, yeah.
5,
Yeah.
to help secure everything around this as well. So I do think it's coming. I do think we're being forced. The forcing fact, there's forces, pushing us that way. But it's the debt and the legacy devices that have lagged.
Bottom line, 8-bit works for a clinical indication to keep your heart beating. If you want to encrypt that channel, you're going to need more bits. And that's the transition that we're making and that Kyle's spearheading at Efron.
You mentioned hardware acceleration or hardware accelerators on the device. Are you doing that only for encryption purposes? And what level of encryption are y'all like AES 256 or whatever?
256 for now, yeah.
Okay, and then is it also for, you mentioned kind of a possible machine learning element to just detect? So is the accelerator for that or just security?
Right now the accelerator is for security. And it was it was for twofold. I'll say it's for security, about 80%, 20% was the chip upgrade that we did, had the hardware accelerator with it, and we liked the Bluetooth chip. So there's kind of there's a hardware element to it, but mainly it was for security. Encryption is a big aspect of it, authorization, code signing, protecting the device in the CAN, doing more advanced things like that from a security. We've talked about doing artificial intelligence in the CAN, but the compute power at the edge in the phone and in the cloud is so much better that we haven't quite found that scenario to do that AI in the CAN today. So, but it's not out of the question.
You wouldn't have to connect it to the internet if you did it inside.
Correct, but I think the ability for, like, we have algorithms that sense detection for all sorts of different conditions in the CAN. We're doing that on a much, so we haven't had that, like, we've been masters, I would say Medtronic, not me, of like being able to improve on a small CPU or improve capabilities of detection in a constrained battery. So we haven't really had that. I guess, it might be an interesting conversation though to better understand what we could do in the CAN versus at the edge.
So with the FDA, from a regulatory perspective today, I followed like some of the adjustments to like approving software in devices and looking at like improving algorithms. And can you talk about where we are in that today and what's done and isn't done?
It's complicated. I think probably the biggest thrust that you see from FDA right now is around the digital health space, right? The Digital Health Center of Excellence. A couple of programs, the pre-cert program, which I can talk to you about, and then AI/ML, and they published the predetermined change control plan, getting to what you're saying, like how do we account for change? where the agency really struggles, and I think Jeff Shuren understands this, is that making changes to software, which was what we need to do in order to counter increasing risks from a cybersecurity perspective, is just not something that they're suited to do. So you see all the policies that come out, like, what was the latest one? It was like assurance and software of manufacturing computers or something like that. You see when a device has a non-device function, when it has a device function. All of this is to try to retrofit that pill model to accommodate software. And that's where the FDA is really struggling. And they tried to do pre-cert program basically to say, hey, and it was brilliant, like let's re-envision what regulation means for software. And they came out just recently, I think it was in September, and basically said, we do not have the regulatory authority to even pursue a program like this.
I can't apply patches because I need FDA approval to apply a patch to like an infusion pump. And that has changed. And what's pre-cert? Like, what are you saying, man?
No, please, yeah. This came when I did my media training when I was in the FDA. This is exactly the problem I had, and I clearly haven't fixed it. So the idea that if I make a change, so if I'm a manufacturer and I was like, I have a cybersecurity issue and I want to go make a software update to reduce that risk, the FDA has come out and multiple policies and said, just go do it. So from the regulatory perspective, they have really reduced the burden to coming back to the FDA, when traditionally, from a legal perspective, they'd be like, no, you need to come in and we need to take 6 months to review this, right? Well, obviously that does not meet the time frame that threat actors operate on. By the way, 12 seconds to take down 20% of the global shipping capacity when Maersk got hit by NotPetya. It operates a different time scale. So the problem is that if you're not, as an industry, and I'm not impugning you particularly, Kyle, but the industry is not, they're not set up to do updates. We're working on it, right? We're trying to get there. So the idea that I can just forego regulatory approval or review is great, except for I have to make sure that that change doesn't break the thing, right? So every change I make assumes that I break it. And when it's connected to a person, I can break a person. There's a bit more gravity to making a change to a device that interacts with a person versus my laptop. Oh, I bricked my laptop. Okay, great. Let's reset it. I can't reset a person. Right? So that's where the problem comes in. So the burden falls to the manufacturer to figure out, like, hey, how do I update this very quickly?
Yes, and having done updates on constrained systems, I'll attest to that, right? They'll just say, hey, annual report, right? Put that in the annual report, go do the update, and in many cases, our verification and validation, that is slow.
They're trying to accommodate emerging technology, right? So, and I think I was talking at dinner about, there's companies out there, they're like, hey, how can I process 100,000 pathology slides like this and then pass the ones that I can't really train on to the pathologist and just cut down on the workload from a pathology perspective? Well, I'm not well versed in the AI space, so I'll just take a shot here. Like, there are different types of algorithms that you can use. You can train on data, you can use untrained algorithms, right? Well, the algorithm itself is changing. The software is changing, right? It's dynamic. So the FDA reviews a static system. How do you determine safety and efficacy, right? How do you say it's reasonably assured to be safe and efficacious if it's changing, right? The data that you provide me has to accommodate for that change. That's where the sort of like, how do I get ahead of that? So that would be that predetermined change control plan.
Back to the issue of reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy, which is FDA's job. And in evaluating products, FDA has, sometimes with emerging technologies, sort of lagged behind, I think, some other, the private sector and the most cutting edge thinking on the matter. As you're looking at a system that you want to make sure is secure 2 decades into the future, or even 6 months into the future, is there the expertise on hand at FDA to evaluate things in real time? How much do you have to just take industry's word for it? And then how do you respond, when there are issues?
By the way, I don't work for the FDA anymore, right? So,
yeah, I know,
okay.
I know. But
yeah.
I'm not here to insult you.
No, and that was the point of the slide, right? Like, I was a chemist, right? I do not have my knowledge base falls off precipitously at some certain point, right? So they're working on it, right? I've seen requisitions for jobs for advertising to bring the cybersecurity expertise in. They need to do it. to your point, like you need to bring people in to make sure that they're looking at it at the right level so that when it hits the market, you are meeting that bar for safety and efficacy. So it's not there yet. And as the primary market driver, you need that to happen. So I was very encouraged to see, their budget request to, and it happens every year, to the president basically say, hey, like we need an additional $5 million, I think was the figure, for cybersecurity specifically, right? Or they wanted to include cybersecurity in the recent Medufa negotiations, which did not make it for reasons, I'm not there, so I wasn't part of the negotiations. I don't know why I didn't make it in. But those are the types of things that if they were in there, then it gives the FDA the power to sort of bring in that talent and to do what you're talking about.
And just to follow up on that,
Yeah,
what
for
surveillance requirements do you have as a medical device manufacturer to report to FDA about what you're doing to improve things, about what you know about, what you don't, and do you ever choose, I don't need to tell FDA?
The post-market guidance really governs a lot of that, right? I would say
Which is
that's-
based in some of the post-market regulations. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. So there is, we've done pre-submissions with the FDA talking about transparency and risk management decisions on cybersecurity to also show how we're making those decisions. We've had audits. So they've come in for additional warning letters that had nothing to do with cybersecurity. Like, well, okay, great. Let's look at your recent corrective actions around cybersecurity and let's pull the risk management files. So they do have some capabilities there. I would say it's still predominantly in pre-market submissions though, where they're really looking at it. It's less in the post, but they have audited me specifically in my function.
So the regulations around reporting are in the pill model, right? So I always use the example of Vioxx and Celebrex. I don't know if folks are familiar with the pharmaceutical space. Recalled drugs for causing cardiac events. It was a COX-2 inhibitor for pain management, right? The time duration at which that problem manifests is exactly what the current reporting regimes that are governed by regulation are built for, right? I mentioned the Maersk one. They're not built for that. So when Kyle puts up a slide about observability, he's like, what are we seeing in real time? And when I say that the FDA needs new regulations, a new model, that's what I'm talking about, right? They need a reporting regime that doesn't require, and I just heard a talk by a UK physician. She's like, we observed these issues. And I'm like, okay, what was the process by which you reported those issues? Like, do you have to fill out paperwork? And she's like, yes. I'm like, wow, that's not gonna work, right? Like it just doesn't, so what are we regulatory obligated to do? That's why we need a different model, different regulations so that we can do real-time observability.
But even in HIPAA, right, there is a risk management scenario for breach, right, within the privacy rule. And so it is on the covered entity in those scenarios to do some level of risk assessment to then therefore report. But in that case, at least there is some grounds for penalty and fine. So I think that's what we're kind of missing. I'm not advocating for it necessarily, but I'm saying we are missing that aspect of it.
Yeah, I might have a kind of comically simple question, but you kind of talked about like a doctor being able to call a patient when an event happens, but what's the main benefit of actually having this connected to the internet?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Remote monitoring. So like we call it a care alert or an alert that says you could be entering into a stage of heart failure that you hadn't before, and then being able to treat it so they come into the hospital as soon as possible.
My question is, we're going over Hollywood's representation of these medical devices and just like dramatization of it. What are the scenarios that keep you both up at night with the current regulations and current medical devices?
And do regs first?
It's the speed and scale at which security issues propagate. I think the ransomware example is a fine one because we already have documented evidence of operations being compromised, right? And not just like at a small scale, like WannaCry 2017, and I know if folks are around for that, 40% of UK's hospital capacity wiped out, right? Those are the types of things that kept me up as a regulator. If we go outside the healthcare space and into critical infrastructure, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware event, like, okay, right? Electrical grid stuff, like really mass casualty stuff from a critical infrastructure standpoint. Those are the things that scare me. Yeah. Also reviewing Medtronic documentation when I was a FDA regulator, but yeah.
Kind of before my time, but
It was before, yeah, he's no. Yeah.
So I would say, I would echo what he said at like a mass scale. I'd say when I'm looking at implantable or suitable or wearable pumps, cardiac devices, neurostims, anything that's on the patient, it's actually a one-to-many attack. It's not really the scenarios we saw there. It's somebody compromising this infrastructure, and there's actually some side fleet management infrastructure. Obviously, this is a crude diagram, and a one-to-many attack down to all devices through the bedside monitors. That's the threat model that keeps me up at night, that I'm always looking for. We didn't talk about all the controls that we have within that fleet management system. Some of that's older technology as well. And so trying to protect that, and that's why we instituted monitoring and observability, because we need to be able to respond in those scenarios if that catastrophic event were ever to happen, that we'd have an intrusion, that somebody was either going to send a message down to the little bedside monitor here, this is actually a program, but bedside monitor saying, hey, pay us a ransom or we'll shock your device, or actually causing harm for some nefarious reason.
So with that, you mentioned quantum computing before, and I hate the buzzword.
Sorry.
It's exhausting. No, but I actually have a question about it though, which is like my rudimentary understanding of quantum computing is it's just an incredibly fast amount of processing power. And so how can you, maybe I'm wrong, but like how could you future-proof that amount of processing power to the medical device or the bridge devices? Like, I guess.
We can't today, right?
Yeah, okay,
There's no hardware today,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
In theory, right? There's no quantum proof encryption yet. There's some submissions going on. I've read some articles arguing that there were just innate flaws in them beyond even their ability to protect against quantum, like legitimately just flaws in the algorithm that could cause additional attacks on it versus even thinking about quantum. So it's a problem that we have to think about more globally. I'm not there yet. So for me, it'll be modular chips. When we get a hardware accelerator at some point that can do the algorithms and talk to, in this case, an iPad, which is thankfully Apple would be trying to solve the same problem at that same time, we can drop a chip into the device and at some point go to some quantum proof encryption algorithm. That would be our only solution. But because it's still theoretical and because it's still years out, it's not as much of a problem today or even in the next 5 to 10 in my opinion. But when it becomes something like that, we're going to have to drop in new hardware into the devices.
Can't believe you don't know your spin states of atomic nuclei. It's crazy.
So I sort of wanted to ask this question of the previous speaker, Dr. Lee. I report for a very general audience, and I imagine someone very much like my editor who loves their wrist device, is not a Uyghur activist in China, doesn't have a heart condition, but might know people who do, and is perfectly happy to sacrifice some of her family's privacy to have the Roomba run around the floor, and because she's much more concerned about the toys there than anyway, I might be her too. And I was really wondering, listening to Dr. Lee, like, how do I make my editor and the listener care? And you've presented two really good ways. A, that people can treat chronic diseases and live longer. And B, dramatic Hollywood scenarios. My question is, I don't really know if I want to go with that. And I'm struggling to imagine engaging a listener, editor, reader with the regulatory side of it. What is your advice? Why are you shaking your head?
I don't have a solution. I was hoping I would come here and you would offer me a solution.
Well, I think
I'm working on it.
I think there's a story. I think there's a story there because the regulators have pushed industry. Maybe Hollywood pushed industry, but the regulators have pushed industry. The guidance, the bar being raised, and the disclosures, the vulnerabilities you've seen in the news. I mean, we were not where we were at. 5 years ago, we were not in the scenario that we are at today, across the board. And I speak with competitors on that as well. We actually had asked some competitors, they just couldn't make it in time to come out here. We were gonna have them talk as well. But I do think the regulators have pushed the manufacturers.
I mean, whoever tells the best story wins, right? So, I've heard of, I haven't experienced it firsthand, where people forego the technology, right? Like they forego the technology that's going to make their life better because they are so concerned about the issue, right? So That's why I went to FDA, right? That's why I did what I did, right? So I have bags under my eyes because I cared so much, and like I don't know how to fix that problem. I don't know how to convince somebody that there are folks that are trying to take care of the problem that they should actually get the technology. It's going to derive much more benefit than the risk.
That's an important point as well, because I've heard of 2 patients across the board, not saying naming manufacturers, but that have explanted devices for fear over cybersecurity. And I think if you did a personal threat model or personal risk assessment, even knowing what I know about the flaws in products, that hurts. Like personally, I take that personal, right? Like just across the industry, we want people to believe and trust that these are safe, knowing that there are risks, but knowing that the therapy benefit should outweigh the cybersecurity risk. And so that's, I think, a tough pill to swallow.
Has anyone done any like public opinion or patient surveys on that kind of thing? Kaiser? Kaiser probably won't pay for it.
Not sure about specific healthcare institutions. FDA did in 2019 do a patient engagement advisory committee on cybersecurity specifically, and basically engage the community and say, what do patients need from a cybersecurity perspective? All of that is on, all out there for consumption. I don't know what the link is, but you can go look at like what patients want from a cybersecurity perspective. I take it back to the message that I had earlier, and that is like generally they don't want to worry about it, right? They have other things to concern themselves with. They just want to know that they don't have to worry about it, right? They can only worry about the condition. But you can go check that out. So there, I believe that engagement, that committee prompted some additional actions, like FDA came out with like, how do we communicate vulnerabilities to patients and that kind of thing. So there is some ongoing efforts from the FDA, but I don't know of any other entities driving that.
So we talked a lot about how the onus for cybersecurity often falls on the individual or the consumer. When it comes to something like updating an insulin pump or a recall, does that onus fall with Medtronic, or is it with the consumer or the local doctor who maybe hasn't updated his own Windows software in like a decade? Like, whose responsibility is it?
In the cardiac space, it's predominantly the manufacturer. We will push updates down. This is the new generation programmer that runs on an iPad. We keep the iPad iOS up to date. We keep the instruments up to date. We look for vulnerabilities. On the implant, if we do push any sort of update, whether it's security or otherwise, that will come down through Medtronic's infrastructure. You'll be in a clinical setting, you'll get interrogated, you'll get an update. On all these instruments over here, we do that as well. There are some scenarios with capital equipment or with more traditional in-hospital products that it is on the hospital clinical IT team or similar clinical engineering team that will have to update it, or field staff. So for the most case, though, in the implantables and the wearable, implantables, insertables, or pumps, it's on the manufacturer. There might be scenarios where we ask for you to open your app, you'll get the latest update, or there might be scenarios where you'll have to have the device connected. But that step should already be kind of part of the traditional workflow of being continuously monitored. So for the most part, it shouldn't have too much. Now, there have been scenarios where we have asked patients to change some configuration, but other than that, it's on Medtronic to communicate.
How much effort are you required to spend to actually get them to do it?
Well, that's why observability is so important, because it's hard to know without that where firmware updates are at, where devices are at, right? Because it's on people, and they're not always connected. But there is a requirement on field corrective actions. You could probably speak better to it than I could. That does require that we communicate to all their physicians to let them know. And this is like a physical letter that has to go out to them. And there is a reporting mechanism that we are obligated by regulators to provide back. Now, that can sometimes be convoluted because I speak in jargon, and that jargon doesn't always get translated to the doctor, which doesn't always get translated to the patient. But we've done ways improving our communication on our security portal to discuss what you need to do, what the actual nature of the event is, and that's why we created more transparency, specifically on Medtronic.com, for our security updates and needs there.
I think where the industry struggles right now is that traditionally we haven't updated devices, so the more like ambulatory cases can't update them. Right, that's why you see in new policy where it's like we need to be able to update them because we encountered issues where it's like, wow, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to pull all those things off the market and we could, change our security posture. It's what I think people are referring to as like a shared responsibility, like who's responsible for the update. So I don't think we've quite figured out as an industry. I would like to see movement towards a more defined responsibility model, right? So then like I am responsible for doing this. That remains to be seen. So we need to drive that.
Kyle and Seth, this was really fascinating. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.